thee verily.
Okay, Barbara's back.
Sorry about that.
Yeah,
That's
that's
okay.
right. Hopefully Nancy will come on in a minute. Okay, Hebrews 11 is interesting. You know, we go from all these different people and you read it and you just the writer of Hebrews just kind of skims over these people and mentions them as men and women of faith. And I read that and I go, man, I can't. I've got to go back and look at these people and see why he's saying they're people of faith. And so that's what we've been doing. Today we're going to take some time with Joseph. Now, truly, if we wanted to study Joseph, Joseph would be a long study. Probably,
Weeks and weeks.
yeah, 3 months or something like that. Just the last 13 chapters of Genesis, for heaven's sakes, is mostly all about Joseph. There's one chapter that isn't, but so yeah, there's a lot there. But we're gonna skim right through it and look at his faith challenges, just like we did with Jacob. Last time we looked at Jacob's faith challenges, and tonight we're going to look at Joseph's faith challenges. And it's a very different experience because Jacob started out with basically having no faith, and he went through all these trials and all this stuff that happened to him, and he finally was a man of faith. But Joseph was a person of faith from the very beginning, and that's what I really love about him. And so I could spend literally hours talking about Joseph. I'll try not to, but we'll catch the highlights. If we don't finish it, we'll pick it up next week. So what the writer of Hebrews says about Joseph is in verse 22. If someone read Hebrews 11:22.
By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions about his bones.
Yeah. So he did this, and so by faith, Joseph at the end of his life. Wait a minute, how did he get there? How do you have faith at the end of his life? Typically, something has to happen to get you there. And there's a whole lot about Joseph, and so we're gonna start where it starts, really talking about him in Genesis. In Genesis chapter 37 is where the story of Joseph begins. And we're not going to read through all this. I would encourage you all to read the story of Joseph in Genesis. Most people are fairly quick readers. You can read it in 20, 30 minutes. Maybe it'd take you an hour to read 13 chapters, but man, is it rich. It's just so rich. I really get into it. So the story of Joseph begins in Genesis 37. He was 17 years old, and he was the favored son of Jacob. Not one of Jacob's best things that he ever did. Not one. You don't want to favor one son over another. That just never works. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, sorry, I couldn't, it just showed up just
Oh, okay.
now.
Well, we're glad to have you on. Let's see. So in the culture of Jacob's culture in that time, the firstborn son was to be the leader of the family. So who was Jacob's firstborn son?
Reuben.
It was Reuben. Reuben was the firstborn son. The problem with Reuben was he lost his place as the leader of the family when he slept with Jacob's wife Bilhah. I don't remember where that's recorded. I don't remember where that's recorded. Normally, then the next in line would have been Simeon, who was the second born, and then Levi, who was the third born. But both of them lost favor with Jacob when they murdered all the men and boys of the city of Shechem over their sister Dinah. What a family. You know, even with all that going on, The beautiful thing about it was God was still watching over them and never gave up on them. He never gave up on them.
Mhm.
That should give us hope. If he didn't give up on them, he's not going to give up on us.
Right.
He doesn't. God's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And then the fourth son would be Judah. So for the fourth son was Judah. Judah became the son who became the kingly line. But we'll get that's another story for another day. So Joseph had 10 brothers who were older than he was. Only Joseph's full brother Benjamin was younger. Joseph was a son of Rachel, and Benjamin was the son of Rachel. Joseph was the first son of Rachel, and Rachel was Jacob's most loved wife. He loved Rachel when he first got to the Laban, and he had to work a whole bunch of years to get her as his wife. And remember, Laban cheated him and gave him Leah instead of Rachel the first time. So, but Jacob treated Joseph with way more favoritism than any of his other sons. This would make siblings in any family jealous.
Right.
And then we, in chapter 37, we find out that Joseph made it worse for himself by tattletaling on his brothers. He went out to watch the sheep on his some of his older brothers, and came back and gave a bad report about them.
Yeah.
And he probably was doing what his father wanted him to do. His father probably said, "Hey, go watch these guys. I don't trust them." But I tell you what, that kind of behavior never works in siblings. It just never goes over well. Just made this jealousy stronger, like pouring gasoline on a smoldering fire.
Right.
And then finally, God gave Joseph dreams. These were dreams that actually came true. They came true later on. And they were dreams of a time when Joseph would truly rule over his brothers. But Joseph, being an immature teenager, was excited about his dreams and told his brothers. His brothers were already stinging from the code of authority Jacob had given him, that the coat of many colors was a special coat that was normally given by a father to the son who would be have the birthright. And they were not happy with that. And now he's talking about having these dreams about ruling over them. They were extraordinarily jealous of him. And it didn't end up well, did it? Ended up with Joseph being sold into slavery. So even though Joseph showed some immaturity through this trial and dealing with his brothers, he continued to trust God through it all. So Joseph's second faith challenge was slavery to Potiphar. Can you imagine the shock of going from the position of the favored son to being a slave? Jesus can. Jesus can. He did it. He did it for us. He was the favored son of God. He left everything in heaven and came down to earth for us. And he endured persecution and harsh treatment and the hatred of his brothers, who were the leaders of Israel. And they put him to death on the cross. Jesus did it. Joseph is a beautiful picture of Jesus, a beautiful picture. So how did Joseph respond to being a slave to Potiphar?
He worked.
He demonstrated faith in God.
Yeah.
Because Joseph was the best slave Potiphar had ever seen. Joseph worked hard. He showed initiative. He didn't complain. and God blessed it. Joseph demonstrated faith in God through his actions and attitudes. He was such a good slave, Potiphar promoted him to be the head of the household. So my question to us is, most of us, none of us, I don't know of any of us that are working except for Barbara. Most of us aren't. Betty, did you work?
Yes, I did. I mean, I'm retired now. I work for
You're
a
retired
law firm.
now, yeah.
Nancy's
Yeah.
Nancy's working, obviously.
Yeah.
But, are we the best employees in our offices?
Yeah.
Do we work hard? It should be that employers are fighting over the Christians, employees, because Christian employees should be such good employees like Joseph that we stand out,
Mm, yes.
that our bosses want us over somebody else because we're doing such a good job.
Mm,
It's convicting to me, especially the complaining part. You ever complain at work? It's bad. It's so easy to complain. It's so wrong too. Our faith in God should be demonstrated by how we live our lives. Do people see the hand of God working in us? Whether you're working now or you're retired, like most of us are. Do people around us see God living in us? I hope so. I hope so. So Joseph's third faith challenge, moving on here, is temptation.
mhm.
Joseph was young and good looking. It says it right in the Bible. You read the
Right.
verses, it says that he was young and good looking. The sex drive in a young man is very strong. And it takes an iron will to say no to it.
Yeah.
And I believe only the power of God can provide that ability.
Yeah.
And Joseph was relying on God. And Potiphar's wife was strongly attracted to Joseph and was doing her best to try to tempt Joseph to sleeping with her. And I like what Joseph said to her in Genesis chapter 39, verses 8 and 9. He said, I'm gonna read it. He says, but he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?
Mm,
Joseph knew that giving into the temptation would be a great sin against God. What faith, what dedication to God.
mhm.
I love this. It didn't get it. I mean, I know that he got punished for saying no, but that's okay. He said no. So his fourth challenge is wrongful accusation. Joseph stayed true to God. He said no to temptation, but this only enraged Potiphar's wife, so she lied to Potiphar and threw Joseph under the bus. You've heard that saying, haven't you? Throwing people under the bus.
Mhm.
People used to say that all the time at work when I was working. Joseph ended up in a dungeon in chains for doing what was right.
At Potiphar's house, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, he was in a dungeon at Potiphar's house, by the way. Talk about a faith challenge. There's a lot of people that have the false idea that trusting God will lead only to good things.
Right.
The Bible does not teach this.
Right.
But I think we need to remember that God will never allow us to be tempted beyond our ability to handle it.
That's
Right.
true. And that's a great promise to cling to. It's a huge promise to cling to.
Right.
But the Bible teaches us when we put our faith in God, we will suffer trials. And sometimes the trials are going to be hard. The beauty of it, and I was talking to David Hill at church today. He's a great guy. David struggles. I love David, but he has Tourette syndrome, really pretty bad. And he has these tics, and you'll be talking to him. All of a sudden, he's bending over and shaking and saying things and that he can't control. He has no control over it.
Mm.
And he's struggled with it. He stayed away from church for a year because he was struggling with it so hard. And he finally said, he told me that he was really God was really dealing with him and showing him that he just had to trust God and just go on.
Mm.
God would be, and that's what I told him. I said, David, sometimes God gives us real hard assignments.
Yeah.
But I said, I put my arm around him. I said, this is what God does, though. In the hard assignment, he puts his arm around you and says, I'm going to walk you right through it.
Right.
That's what God did to Joseph. We see it right here. That's what God did for Joseph. God never left Joseph. And in fact, it says that God continued to bless Joseph even in the dungeon. But Joseph had to spend his time in the dungeon for at least 3 years. That's a long time.
Yeah.
That's a long time. So Joseph's fifth faith challenge, as I like to put it here, is the forgotten by the cupbearer. Remember, while he's in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker were put in prison with Joseph, and they were accused for plotting to kill Pharaoh. And Joseph, because of God's blessing, was caring for them. And during their imprisonment one night, both of the men had dreams and were troubled by them. God sent them the dreams. They were God's dreams that he sent to them. And I believe that he did it for Joseph's sake, because Joseph was in God's school of preparation for interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. God was preparing him. And Joseph had such confidence in God, because in Genesis 40, verse 8, he says, and they said to him, we've had dreams and there's no one to interpret them. And Joseph said, do not interpretations belong to God?
Mm-hmm.
Please tell them to me. He believed that God would give him those interpretations. And God did. And the interpretations that Joseph gave for the dreams were completely accurate. And they completely were fulfilled very shortly, 3 days. And he asked the cupbearer when he was going to be released to remember Joseph to Pharaoh, because he was being wrongly held in prison. But that wasn't part of God's plan. So the cupbearer forgot about him. And it was at least another year.
It was 2 years.
But through it all, Joseph's faith never wavered. And now, I'm sure that he had moments when he was struggling with his faith, but overall, his faith never wavered. So Joseph's sixth faith challenge is Pharaoh's dream. So Pharaoh dreamed a very strange dream. We're not going to get into the dream, but he remembered it and was troubled by it. God wanted him to be troubled by it. This is all God's perfect plan.
Mm-hmm.
God's plan was to have Jacob's family move to Egypt, where they could develop into a whole nation in Egypt, not being assimilated into the culture in Canaan. What was going to happen if they didn't move to Egypt, they were all going to marry into Canaanite families, and they'd just be assimilated into the country.
They came out of Egypt a separate nation.
And they came out of Egypt as a separate nation. This was God's plan all along.
Mm-hmm.
And the cupbearer remembered Joseph and spoke up to him, and Joseph was brought up from the dungeon, cleaned up, and brought before Pharaoh. And Joseph faced this challenge with great confidence in God. If you read the story, what great confidence. And not only did he gave glory to God, and then he interpreted Pharaoh's dream, but he went way beyond the interpretation. He told Pharaoh how to respond to the crisis described by God through the dream and what he should do about it. That's a lot of guts, to put it in a vulgar way, really. It's a lot of courage to do that.
Yeah.
But he did it. And in fact, Pharaoh said, who should we choose to do what Joseph is saying? He said, there isn't anybody else here that's filled with the Holy Spirit like Joseph.
You're it.
And he said, in you is the spirit of the
Living God.
of the living gods. He recognized God in Joseph. What a testimony that is.
You know, I was saying, this may have been a note you said in one of your classes 10 years ago or something, who knows, or it could have been a Pastor Billy thing, but I said, so here we are in a pagan country, so where it's darkest, a candle will shine the brightest, the light will shine the brightest. And I thought that was a perfect,
Yep, where's darkest?
sentence for that.
I didn't say it, but somebody did.
Yeah, I don't know who said it. The note I took, I thought it was so
That's a good note. That's good. Yeah. So then Joseph's seventh faith challenge was meeting his brothers. After 7 good years and a couple of years of severe famine, Joseph's brothers found out they were hungry, because the famine wasn't just in Egypt, it was also in Canaan where they were living. And Jacob sent them to buy food in Egypt. And Joseph met them. He was looking for them. He knew they were going to come. And Joseph's treatment of his brothers also challenged and demonstrated his faith. I would think most people would have held a grudge and would have at least thrown his brothers into prison.
Yeah.
But Joseph wasn't most people. He was different because of his strong faith in God. And he did challenge his brothers. He didn't let them get off scot-free.
Yeah.
He challenged them. But every time they showed that they had changed, Joseph became an emotional wreck. He'd have to go into a room somewhere and weep.
I'm sure he almost felt like, I don't want to forgive him, after what they, probably what they did just kept, I'm sure Satan just kept bringing that back to his mind and everything, but his faith proved to be so strong,
That's right.
so strong.
I also think by this time Joseph had an idea what was going on. He says,
True.
God did this. He says, and the God brought you down here to save you,
Yeah.
to save the people, save our nation. And I think Joseph realized that by this time, but it took him all those years being down there to figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah, because at the end of Genesis, it says what God intended for, what the brothers had intended for evil, God intended for good.
Right.
God, that's right.
Right.
God always does that.
Yeah.
He's been doing that from the very beginning,
Oh, I know.
and he's still doing it today.
Indeed.
Amen.
So then Joseph's eighth challenge was his brother's fear. So after Jacob died and was buried with much fanfare, by the way, half of Egypt went with Joseph into Canaan to bury his father, and they had great mourning and so forth. So much it got the attention of all the people around there.
This is years later too.
Yeah, it was 17 years later. But his brothers were terrified after Jacob's death that Joseph would now take a revenge on them. And they came practically crawling on their hands and knees to Joseph. And what was Joseph's reaction in Genesis 50? He wept. He wept. He said, what you meant for evil, God has used for the good, for good. He's turned it into good. The same way he took Rebecca and Jacob's deception and turned it into his good purposes. Joseph's action, what God did for Joseph, going through all the things he went through, by this time he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was God working, and it was God. He told his brothers, please go. This was God, not me. Don't worry about me. This was God doing a great thing to save
Mhm.
many lives.
Mhm.
Joseph's actions, his actions proved his great faith in God.
Yeah.
And then his ninth faith challenge is what Hebrews 11 talks about. At the end of his life, he called his family together and he said, God is going to lead you out of Egypt in the future. Make sure my bones go to the promised land.
Mhm.
He did.
He said, it's going to happen. God's going to lead you out. Just make sure that you take my bones with you. And they did. It was prophetic, but few people we've studied and will study demonstrated the faith like Joseph. Few. From the very beginning of their lives, there are just few people, even in the Bible, that showed faith like Joseph from the beginning all the way to the end. I can think of one other, and that would be Daniel, for which nothing really bad is recorded about them.
There's no sin recorded.
No sin.
Somebody once told me about Genesis, and it always struck me. Genesis begins with creation and good, but it ends here with death. That's because sin entered the world.
Yeah.
Thought that was a profound statement.
That is a profound statement, yes. Genesis is a very, very important book in the Bible. And I'm really glad that, Nancy, that you guys translated Genesis early on, because it's such an important book. It's really important to understanding a lot of things in the New Testament. It really is. Genesis is a book of beginnings, and there's so many things that started, and so many of God's promises are recorded in Genesis.
Well, if we don't have the recording of why we have sin, we don't know why we need a savior.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
There's so many things, so many reasons. Genesis is really critical to our faith.
And the greatness of God. You know,
Yes,
the fact that he created it all.
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
correct.
Truly.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And when he created it, it was all good.
It was until sin came into the world. And then sin tainted everything he created. But one day in the future, it's going to be renewed and remade. And all the bad stuff that's caused by sin is going to be completely obliterated. And it's all going to be new.
The thing is, we've already got victory. Victory's at hand. It's already been achieved.
Yeah.
At the cross. Yeah.
That's right. So next week, we'll study Moses. So the next character in Hebrews 11 is Moses. There's actually several verses about Moses, and that's rightly so, because Moses
It's huge.
is so important to Israel. It's where the law was given and so forth. And Moses is very critical. And Moses' name in the Gospels is mentioned so many times by Jesus himself. Moses was important. And who was it that met Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration? It was Moses and Elijah.
Elisha, right?
Moses and Elijah.
Mhm.
I always wondered how they knew it was Moses and Elijah. They'd never seen him before.
He had name tags.
Maybe he got name tags.
Name tag Sunday.
Well, it's written right in the Bible somewhere, their eyes
Sunday.
were opened.
That's right.
Yeah,
Well, Jesus may have said, hey, Moses, hey, Elijah, how are you doing?
but I always wondered that. That's just,
I have a little story to tell, Gary. Many,
right?
many years ago, I heard a sermon that I just remembered this little blip out of it. Don't remember whether it was TV, local, or whatever, but seeing how you were talking Joseph and then Moses, and you mentioned the word plan. Well, I've heard the word plan a couple times this session. What was Joseph doing when he was put into slavery? What was his job
In slavery or before?
before slavery?
His job was favored son.
Well, I mean, sweat and everything. What did he do every day?
Well, you probably had a flock that he managed.
Yeah, he was watching sheep probably.
Yeah, he was a shepherd.
Yeah,
Okay. What did Moses do before God sent him back to Egypt?
He was a shepherd.
he was a shepherd.
Okay. Now this preacher's bringing all this together and saying, in that culture and in that period of time, the lowest job in the world was a shepherd.
That's right. The
But
Egyptians.
God took two shepherds and brought his planned nation into Egypt. And with a shepherd led his nation out of Egypt.
True.
Yeah,
But I don't remember anything else about the sermon.
and then he had a shepherd who was the greatest king, who was David.
That's
Was-
right.
And Jesus was a good shepherd.
And Jesus is the good shepherd, and all the sheep hear his voice and know him.
And
follow
follow him.
That's right.
And that makes us sheep.
That's a string. That's a string that of information that goes all the way through.
Well, but the Bible's very good at that. Even though it's all these different books, there's, it's one story and themes don't change
Right.
all the way through.
We should just be saying, instead of not speaking nice, we'd be saying, bah. We're a bunch of sheep.
Yeah. I'm gonna stop this recording.